Hello, everyone. I'm Sarasat Khan. I'm the regular events director for the Historical Society of Ottawa. Um, I know I am just an image on the screen right now. I am having some video technical difficulties. Um, but I'd like to welcome you to November's virtual presentation from Phil Emberley called A Holocaust Testimonial, My Father's Story. Tonight's presentation is given in partnership with the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship. Before we begin, let's take a moment to acknowledge whose land it is that we meet on tonight. Can we have the next slide, Phil? Thank you. For thousands of years before colonial times, the members of indigenous communities traveled from far and wide to gather at the meeting of the three rivers, the Ottawa, the Gatineau, and the Rideau, from the Chaudière Falls to the mouth of the Gatineau River. This area is rich in natural resources, plants, animals, and fish, and also provided a convenient meeting place for trade and communication among communities. Of special significance are the burial place at Hull Landing and Chaudière Falls, a sacred place for the meeting and sharing in ceremonies. The burial grounds in the Ottawa-Gatineau corridor, including Hull Landing, were important for rituals of respect and bonding with the landscape. Victoria Island, located under the Portage Bridge, continues to provide this sacred space to local and visiting Indigenous people. The National Capital Region, which includes the City of Ottawa, remains unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. We encourage our members and guests to reflect on this, our connected history, and the ways we can contribute to reconciliation. Next slide, please. Next, we would like to extend our thanks to the City of Ottawa, the Province of Ontario, and last but never least, to our membership. Without your support, none of what the Historical Society of Ottawa does would be possible. The Historical Society of Ottawa has been telling Ottawa's great stories for 128 years. We host two parallel speaker series, one virtual and one in person. Next slide, please. Next slide. Our next in-person presentation will happen on November 23rd at 1:30 with Jeff Wang presenting Beneath the Archway, the history of Ottawa's Chinese community. Next slide. On March 28, Alison Margot Smith will present the Rideau Canal. Finally, on April 27th, next slide, please. On April 27th, James Powell will tell us about the era of Viscount. That brings us to tonight's presentation. A quick reminder to everyone to kindly keep your settings on mute so as not to interfere with our speaker's presentation, and to also turn off your video feed once we get going. This will assist with our overall transmission as well. Tonight's presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. So please, during the presentation, start typing your great questions into the chat box so I can ask Phil afterwards. Here to introduce our speaker is Mina Cohn. Mina was born in Israel and has lived in Ottawa for 40 years. Both her parents were Holocaust survivors. An archaeologist by profession, an educator, and a seasonal professor at Carleton University and St. Paul's University, Mina has a strong interest and in an extensive experience with Holocaust education. She is the chair of the Center of Holocaust Education and Scholarship. Over to you, Mina.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm the chair of the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship here in Ottawa. I am going to briefly share with you a few words about the center and then introduce Phil. CHESS, the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship, was established 10 years ago as a community-based independent charity to offer year-round programming that aim at combating anti-Semitism, prejudice, and racism, and promote respect and diversity for human rights. Chess events attract a wide audience within and without the Jewish community, including diplomats, representatives of government, community leaders, educators, students, and the general public. We promote knowledge and understanding of the history and legacy of the Holocaust with through our annual Holocaust Education Month in November. We just finished a few of our events for November, and this is one of them. I want to share one important project with you, which I think you might find of interest, and that is the iWalk app, which is a significant multimedia project developed by Chess in partnership with Liberation 75 and the USC Shoah Foundation, and was funded by the Government of Canada. This professionally curated interactive bilingual app offers a remarkable way to enhance visits to the National Holocaust Monument in Ottawa. Chess plays an essential role in preserving the voices of survivors and their children, the descendants, who have made Ottawa their home. Through our project, Through Their Eyes, we are enabling descendants of Holocaust survivors to carry on the work of their parents using new media to reach today's audience. At this point, I'm very pleased to introduce Phil Amberley, a pharmacist by profession and a longtime member of Chess, who will share with you his father's story.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Mina. First of all, I'd like to express my thanks to the Historical Society of Ottawa for inviting me to speak tonight. I would also obviously like to express my thanks to Mina and to Chess. The story that I'm going to present tonight, members of Chess really encouraged me to tell this story, and I'm really pleased to be able to share it with you today. And I would like to welcome everyone who's on the call today. Mina mentioned the Through Their Eyes project. This is an intro slide that we often use when we speak in schools, just to inform people about how they can find out more information about the Holocaust. I think that it's important to mention, and Mina touched on this, is one very important function that Chess has had in the past is to arrange for Holocaust survivors to speak in schools and also to others about their experiences and what they've experienced during the Holocaust. And this testimony has been extremely powerful because it's real life lived experience, and it's authentic. Sadly, many of the survivors have now passed away, and there are actually very few that are left. The Through Their Eyes project is designed a little bit differently to have their descendants speak about their relative story. And it's not exactly the same as having a survivor, but there is the ability to continue the story and to also perhaps reflect on what the impact of the Holocaust had on survivors. So in terms of what I hope to present today, first of all, I'd like to provide information about the Holocaust and acknowledge that people joining us today come to this with various levels of understanding and knowledge. I will be speaking from the perspective of from a family, from true experiences, and using the written accounts of a survivor, namely my father. My father, at age 55, began to write a journal. And I would recall quite fondly that I would see him at the breakfast table writing fervently in his journal and, writing about things. He would tell us he would write about his daily work experiences, perhaps their vacation plans. He would talk about family events. It was only after he passed away that I realized that he was writing so much more in this journal. And in fact, he was writing about his early life experiences in during the Holocaust, and I began to see a whole different side of my father that I had never known while he was still alive. I felt at the time, or since then, in reading this testimony, that he had intended this not only for his family to know about the Holocaust and his experiences, but that this could be shared further. And I'm really happy to be able to share some of that with you today. Some of it has never been shared publicly before. When I read my father's journal, though, I don't think it's only and his intent was simply to provide a historical record. I think that he had some very important lessons that I think would be worthwhile to reflect upon. One thing that I recall very vividly, he said in his lifetime, was a cliche that we hear often today, and that is, if we ignore history, we're doomed to repeat it. And I see it as crystally clear today as when he said it, because he said it so often. And the times that we live in suggest that perhaps we have not learned from history because we see the same sorts of mistakes happening repeatedly. The other thing that was a very important message, and again, something I think we should reflect on, is that um, how important it is to protect our democracy, to fight for our democracy and basic human rights. Canada has one of the strongest democracies in the world. And so very often we don't really realize how important it is. And it's only when we see things happening in other countries that we realize how vital it is to protect our democracy. And this is something that my father constantly would talk about in his journal, and he even spoke to us about how he saw parts of the world where the democracy was eroding. So let me dive in now. I acknowledge the fact that not everybody has perhaps a strong background in history. There may be those that do, and if I repeat things that are obvious to them, I apologize. But what I'd like to do is very briefly, in terms of creating context for my father's story, talk about Germany in the 1920s and the 1930s. Talk a little bit about the Holocaust in terms of the final solution, and of course, Germany and World War II. Um, Germany in the 1920s was a very turbulent time. The Treaty of Versailles significantly um, impacted Germany. The Germans had actually, as a result of their aggression in World War I, they were faced with significant reparations that they had to pay to the Allies and to other countries. And it affected the German economy and resulted in very much a defeatist morale among Germans following the outcome of World War I. There were things improved somewhat with the introduction of the Weimar Republic in 1919, initially creating hope, but unfortunately it failed miserably, resulting in hyperinflation and political extremism. Things started to improve a little bit in the 1920s, at the end of the 1920s, but the Great Depression resulted in further collapse of the economy and also collapse of the government at that time. So I'm trying to create this image that there was tremendous instability at the time in Germany. And this allowed for the extremism that was to follow. And we all know what that was. In the 1930s, Adolf Hitler in 1933 was declared the Chancellor of Germany. He would lead a coalition government despite the fact that his Nazi party held only 2 out of 10 cabinet seats. Also in 1933, and under what were assumed to be emergency conditions, the government brought in legislation that allowed the chancellor to have broad new powers, which Hitler used to suppress democracy and eventually create a modern day dictatorship. I'd like to speak a little bit about the Nuremberg laws. This was a significant event that occurred in the 1930s, enacted in 1935, and I really want to highlight this because it had a significant impact on the family story that I'm going to describe. So these laws were clearly anti-Semitic, and there were 3 key provisions. The first one was the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, which disallowed Jews from having relations or marrying German citizens. The second was that the Reich citizenship law said that only those who were German, i.e., not Jewish, were allowed to be Reich citizens. So it made a very clear distinction between Jewish people and Germans. And this was something that obviously was highly anti-Semitic. A supplement to these laws made specific reference to the definition of what it meant to be Jewish. And this was a complicated process of examining the heredity of parents and grandparents. One of the things I don't mention in this slide is that the laws also took away any capacity for Jewish people to have ownership, management capacity, or directorship in German companies. So they were not to have any role in organizations in these types of capacity. And this is something else that will, as I mentioned later, have a significant impact on my family. In terms of the Germany and the final solution, the Nuremberg laws, as you can imagine, gave the Nazis considerable powers to persecute Jewish people, including encouraging citizens to spy on their neighbors and permitting the arrest of Jewish people without much evidence. And this was actually quite widespread in the 1930s. People were really encouraged to spy on their neighbors, and any transgression would be brought forward to the authorities. We have likely all heard about the final solution, which was initiated in 1941 by Adolf Hitler. And this was a plan to systematically eliminate Jewish people from Germany through deportation and imprisonment, and quote unquote, with an aim to murder every last Jew in the German grasp. So I provide that as a background to the family story, which I'm going to describe now. My father's family's surname was Ager. They were Jewish, and they lived in Frankfurt am Main, which is in the northwest corner of Germany. And people who visit it today, they will notice it's considered the financial hub of the country. The family had lived in this area of Germany for many centuries. And alluding back to the Nuremberg laws, the Ager family were Germans who happened to be Jewish. And for them to find out about the law that now said that Jews could not be were not to be considered German would have been absolutely devastating. And this was only the first of many very hurtful things that affected the Ager family. Heading the household was Bertold Ager, who was a managing director of a company that sold supplies to butchers in the city. His wife, my grandmother Mina, was an accountant. Their only child, Dieter, who was my father, was born November 11th, 1925. Sadly, these two photographs are the only photographs that exist of my father and his parents, probably taken in the early 1930s. There are no other pictures that remain of them. So now speaking directly to my father's journal, it's very interesting because the journal is, you really have to read it carefully to find excerpts where he goes back to his early childhood. He found it very difficult to talk about this at any length. So it's not as if he wrote about it for pages at end. He would put excerpts, and then he could only think about it for so long before the trauma would stop him and compel him to move on to a different subject. So one of his first entries was this: our house in the 30s. The overriding factor in all of these accounts of poverty, one describes it as such within hindsight, not really knowing such at the time as more and more people began to fit the category. Our kitchen consisted of a cast iron stove, which gave some heat and cooking facilities when food was available. I recall sometimes carrying a bucket of coal from the basement. The bathroom was largely out of order in view of assorted water problems. Toilet paper was newspaper torn up because we presumably couldn't afford the real thing. The apartment was heated, again when fuel was available, via a huge tiled stove in the living room. That was our life, our basic life in the four walls, with mothers slaving from morning to night at chores which could have been performed in an hour or two given the right tools. Father was given hot water to shave, but we all washed in cold water daily. Water was carried in a pitcher from the kitchen to the bedroom and then poured into a porcelain bowl. I do not recall when we were not short of money. My earliest recollection is sleeping in my parents' room in a white metal cot with high sides. Presumably, it was my bed from birth, and certainly until about age 11. In order to describe the next excerpt, I have to describe this picture. So in Germany, even today, there's actually quite a fond tradition where on the first day of school, children are given a container in the shape of a cone that is full of candy. And they'll take this candy to school. They'll share some of it with their schoolmates and then bring the rest of it home and consume it there. So I have no recollection whatsoever until my first day when I went off, probably alone, clutching this package, which was called a Zuckertüte, which had been filled with candy bought under some great financial hardship. Mine was torn from me by boys who, in the years ahead, became Hitler Youth or Hitler Jugend, as they were called. On that day, I faced taunting due to my superficial religious persuasion for the first time. In terms of Dieter's first school years, school in Germany started in the Easter, again, a quote from him, which in my case entailed entering grade 1 in 1932. This was an ordinary elementary school attended by anybody, incidentally, a very long walk from home. In 1935, when racial laws had been promulgated, my attendance at that school was no longer feasible. I transferred to a Real Gymnasium, or high school, the following year. That was a Jewish school, although nowhere in the curriculum was there any religious influence. We had a daily assembly, and as the number of teachers and students decreased markedly as the years passed. It is difficult for any to comprehend that I have never seen a student from the day I left Frankfurt to this day. Many of them have perished in the concentration camps. Again, referring to his educational years, the school had huge steel doors, perhaps 4 meters high, which allowed access to the elementary school, which I attended for a few weeks before being admitted at age 10 to the high school located across the yard. Having had a hazardous walk through Nazi-infested areas, I had to wait at the gates until they were opened punctually. The harassment en route consisted primarily of threats and balled fists. Being on my own during the majority of these walks, I cannot fathom to this day how they knew who I was. Daily life under the shadow of the swastika began in earnest when Adolf Hitler became the chancellor on the 30th of January, 1933. I recall my father coming home from his business that evening, using the words something like, Die Nationalsozialisten sind am Ruder, the Nazis hold the reins, and my mother answering, Wie schrecklich, how terrible. Life under the Nuremberg laws was extremely difficult. One was not permitted to use park benches, go to the cinema or to the theater, frequent restaurants or businesses during certain hours, or enter certain professions. I recall an incident of around 1937, which tells all. My father was seen at a tram stop near Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht is a transit hub that's located in the heart of Frankfurt. And he was talking to a female colleague. Somehow, this totally innocent incident was conveyed to my mother by evil tongues. Because Der Stürmer, which was a Nazi daily propaganda paper, brought daily articles about illegal relationships between Jewish and non-Jewish Germans, my mother was deadly afraid. The racial laws, as detailed in the Nuremberg laws, made any relationship between Aryans and non-Aryans a racial defilement. Just to elaborate a little bit further, this is the cover of Der Stürmer from the early 1930s. There's on the very bottom, it says, Jews are our misfortune. And it was a very vile publication that was printed weekly. And the photograph was typical, or the picture was very typical of what they would put on the cover. It depicts a snake, which represents the Jewish influence, attacking an Aryan maiden. And this was the kind of vile propaganda that they would circulate. The publisher was someone by the name of Julius Streicher, who, because of what he had published, was later found guilty of crimes against humanity in the Nuremberg trials and was subsequently hanged as a result. The as you can imagine, everything that was going on around them, resulted in the family descending into poverty, especially as a result of the Nuremberg laws. So, another quote from my father, having been greatly demoted in his company, which had been publicized, meant a considerable loss of income. This had to suffice to look after us three, grandmother and others, who occasionally dropped in for something to eat. Meals were rye bread, often spread with lard, soups containing small scraps of meat, and such things as rice or other pudding as a meal. My grandmother occasionally went to Baron Rothschild's villa and at the back door begged for financial help. The Rothschilds, of course, were an influential family in Germany, and they owned a villa on the outskirts. And my father's grandmother, Matilda, would go there to beg for financial help. She left us sometime in 1938 to enter an old age home, as my parents could no longer afford to feed her. So, one of the important events that happened in 1938 on December the 9th was Kristallnacht. This is something that we commemorated just a few nights ago. And the events leading up to that are very important to mention. And that is on the 7th of December, 1938, a Polish Jew named Herschel Greenspan killed a German diplomat. His rationale for doing this was that his family had been previously arrested and was to be deported to Poland. This assassination that took place was the reason the Nazis used this to initiate Kristallnacht, an event of terror that was launched against Jews across Germany, resulting in the burning of synagogues, the destruction of businesses, and the arrest of Jews. One thing that's important is that Kristallnacht or Crystal Night, translated into English, was named because of the destruction of Jewish homes, synagogues, and businesses, and the resultant broken glass that filled the streets. And it's in recent times, it's been felt that the term Kristallnacht was really too benign a term. And in fact, more appropriately, the term that's used now is the word pogrom. Pogrom indicates a violent riot that is aimed at the massacre or deportation of Jews. And in Germany, when they commemorate Kristallnacht, now they call it the Reichspogromnacht instead of referring to it as Kristallnacht as a result of this important distinction. In terms of my father's experience on this evening, on December 9th, 1938, on this very evening, Dieter was preparing for the rehearsal for his bar mitzvah ceremony, which was to be held the next day at a nearby synagogue. That night, the synagogue was burned down, along with the destruction of local businesses. Dieter's father, Berthold, was arrested and sent to Buchenwald concentration camp, one of 30,000 Jews who were arrested that evening. The Dieter's journal entry, I think, was very poignant. This is, of course, written many, many decades after, and the clarity of his memory is something that I really quite admire. Sometime between 6 to 8 p.m. on the 9th of November, 1938, two SS men knocked on the front door of our apartment and directed father to accompany them, taking only the most meager toiletry articles. Virtually hiding behind drapes, we saw father and others crammed on the back of an open truck. Father was taken to the concentration camp Buchenwald during the same night that 30,000 were rounded up and taken to various camps. Father was released after 10 days, as he had been a decorated soldier in the German army during World War I. No reason for his incarceration was ever given, nor on his return did he tell us what had transpired. On the morning of the 10th of November, one could see the burnt out synagogues, the broken windows of stores, the Kristallnacht term stemmed from it, and the looted shops and more. It's ludicrous to believe that the whole population was unaware of these events, including the existence of concentration camps. My father, every year, starting, well, even before he began his journals, would silently commemorate Kristallnacht without fail, without anyone in his family knowing. There was only one time that I can recollect that he actually mentioned to me very briefly about his experiences with Kristallnacht, and I believe he was well into his 70s. And at the time that he mentioned it, there were still tears in his eyes. On the 9th of November 1982, so again, many decades after this event, he wrote the following. It is perhaps more appropriate to remember my parents on this date than on any birthday or other family occasion. The pogrom of the 9th of November 1938 was the beginning of their eventual murder. Much as we suffered before, this actually spelled the beginning of physical and extension of mental punishment. This date must be never forgotten, for it is totally innocent, the totally innocent who suffered merely for bearing a certain label. As you can imagine, after Kristallnacht, after the November program, the feeling among German Jews was particularly tense. A quote, my father's employment ceased after he was taken to the concentration camp. The company went into the hands of the Nazi member in trusteeship, and my father was without a job. I have no idea what we lived on from then until I went to England on the 21st of August, 1939, or for that matter, until my parents were deported and murdered in Lodz, Poland in 1941. Efforts to leave Germany by whatever means possible was now an urgent priority among Jewish people, as many Jews saw their lives in extreme peril. Perhaps I've not mentioned this previously, but my parents and I attempted to emigrate to England, the US, Bolivia, or Madagascar, all through friends or family or relatives, yet all without success. I remember the endeavor with some clarity. Paula Burgess, who was a family friend, tried to get mother a job as a cook and father a job as a butler in one of England's stately homes, a Lord and Lady Hambling. But this ran into the sand, if for no other reason than lack of qualifications. The saving grace for my father came by route of the Kindertransport. In 1938, the British cabinet passed a bill that would allow 10,000 children unaccompanied by parents to leave Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. The logistics were performed by British, Jewish, and Quaker organizations. And as my father has stated in his journals, children were told that they were going on a holiday. Many of these kids were quite young, as young as 4 years old. My father was actually one of the older ones. So they were often told that they were going on holiday and that they would likely see their parents again, but most of them never did. Many, upon arrival, were converted to Christianity. This photograph is actually a picture taken at almost the exact time that my father left Frankfurt. It's a photograph of the Frankfurt main train station. Dieter's train left Frankfurt on the 24th of August, 1939, 1 week before the start of World War II. This is, I think, an important quote. My departure was miraculous, that it could still happen between 7 days, Hitler's march into Poland, and 9 days, the Allies declaring war. It is this time frame that I should recall time and time again, remembering God's will that I should be saved. One very interesting fact that my father mentioned in his journal is the attack on Poland, which was codenamed Fall Weiß, meaning white plan, was actually planned for a week prior. So this would have put it roughly around the 25th or the 26th of August. He felt that had that happened, had they actually attacked Poland when it was planned, the borders would already have been sealed and he would not have survived. The Kindertransport, which managed to save 10,000 children, ended as soon as the war began. I want to draw attention to the bag. This is a book bag on the screen. This was one of the very few items that my father was able to take out of Germany. They were obviously limited how much that they could take. This was a book bag that he was given around during his elementary school years, and it was one of his prized possessions. And it's actually one of the few artifacts that I have from my father from this era. So another quote from my father, quite specifically, I recall the journey, probably by streetcar, complete with a suitcase, to the station in Frankfurt en route to England. I was accompanied by both parents, I believe, and vaguely remember waving from the train window. The doors of the cars were locked and sealed. It was the last time we were ever to see of each other. Um, just a few months ago, I actually managed to receive, or I was sent a manifest of the individuals who were on that train ride with him. There were 81 children, ranging in age from 4 to age 15 years, that made this particular trip, escorted by a small number of chaperones. The train left Frankfurt, Germany, and then traveled to Rotterdam, Netherlands, before stopping in the south of the Netherlands, where the children boarded the ferry for England. My father's name is number 4 from the top in this particular page from the manifest. The map that I'm showing on the screen now is the trip that was taken by the train and subsequently by the ferry. It actually started before Frankfurt, but it came through Frankfurt, up to the north of Germany, crossed over into the Netherlands, and then there was a ferry trip from the Hook of Holland to Harwich, which is the first town that they hit on reaching the United Kingdom. My father doesn't recall a lot about his trip, but he does recall the train station, the train platform in Rotterdam, where Dutch soldiers in their cold scuttle helmets were readying to go somewhere on mobilization. I do not recall the crossing of the English Channel, presumably from the Hook of Holland to Harwich, and even less arrival at the children's refugee camp. I find his first days in England to be very interesting. And he quotes, "I do not remember much of my first 8 days in the UK, only the theft of my chocolate bars. The 3rd of September outbreak of war, though, was as clear as yesterday. We were not yet 14-year-olds, some younger, some older. We're digging slit trenches in the grounds of our camp, which we were not allowed to leave, when a broadcast by Mr. Chamberlain, then Prime Minister, was beamed across the grounds at 11 a.m. And now we're at war with Germany. Little did I understand the rest, as my English was still faulty, but these words left an indelible imprint. Visualize for the next 3 months, standing along the perimeter fences of the camp, watching the arrival of the butcher van, the baker, and other vans, same time each morning. A girl on a bike, perhaps 16 years old, also came daily to stare at us and we at her. Not a word was ever exchanged. The appearance of typical English loaves of bread and their peculiar shape is a sight I shall always cherish. During this 3-month period, I believe I learned nothing of British life. It had merely been changing one ghetto for another, although the potential for good existed. Many of the children who arrived on the kinder transport were formally adopted, especially the younger ones, formally adopted by parents and became part of their families. In the case of Dieter, he only had one foster parent who had had a home for several foster children. And really, to be frank, he was not a true parent in any way. Dieter's foster parent was a retired military officer, which probably impacted Dieter's decision to join the army in 1944. Um, Interestingly enough, Dieter's foster parent, who I think was fairly wealthy, enrolled him in a fairly exclusive private school in the south of London called Dulwich College. And I managed to reach out to the archivist of this college a few months ago, who provided me with this information from his school records. And she states, sadly, your father was only here for 2 terms from January 1940 to July 1940, to July 1940. I've attached a school record, a summary of his school reports, plus a letter sent in 1951. And I'm going to elaborate on that, which is actually quite interesting. For the short time he was at the college, he was on the modern side, which specialized in modern European languages. The boys also studied Latin, history, English, mathematics, science, and geography. You will see on the summary report card that he came 24 out of 27 in the first term and 25 out of 30 in the second term. I bring this up, I mention this because if you look at my father's the timeline, you'll notice that he said he spent very little time in formal education. And I think he must have found himself to be completely a duck out of water, to be enrolled in such an exclusive private school, struggling to speak English because he only had very, very primitive command of the English language. Dulwich College today is, again, it exists today, and it's a very exclusive private school known for its high academic standards. But given his limited schooling, Dieter struggled, and he was only registered for 2 terms. His ability to speak English was limited, and he lagged academically behind his classmates. One thing I find very interesting was that, and he mentions this, that he was considered a legal alien in the UK. And life was difficult as an illegal alien because he would constantly have to report to the police, especially if he was traveling anywhere in England. And this is a very interesting excerpt because in 1951, they were trying to track down information about him, and they contacted the college to say, "Do you know anything about this D.W. Ager? Or do you know a master at the college who knows anything about him?" He was there for 2 months, and apparently Scotland Yard, the detective agency, had a request that was sent to them from the Canadian police. And I guess at this point in 1951, my father had joined the Canadian military, and the Canadian police, the RCMP, were trying to figure out how was it that he managed to leave Germany? What were the circumstances of this? Because at that time, anyone who was German who came to the UK was actually suspected of possibly being a collaborator or had been a collaborator with the Nazi regime. And I mentioned this partially because many people in my father's position were very, very keen to change their name because and take on an anglicized name because anyone who had a German name was automatically suspect. Which brings us to the next point, and that is that in his late teens or early 20s, Dieter went to a phone booth with this particular aim in mind. He opened up a telephone directory and chose a name that had the same initials as his own. And he would therefore only use this name, Dennis Walter Emberley, and never, ever again use the name Dieter Ager. And I find this quite very, very unusual. To this day, I get people contacting me and asking me if I'm related to the Emberleys, for example, in Nova Scotia. And I tell them there's absolutely no chance that we could be related. My father enlisted in the British Army in 1944. One of his first jobs was to return to Germany, 1944, as part of the British occupational force, not far from where he grew up. The role of this force was the denazification of the British sector of post-war Germany. I'm going to stop here for a second because I find this absolutely amazing that here was somebody who was returning to the country of his birth and was now facing his former persecutors and holding them to account. And I wish I could have the discussion with him now to ask him what it felt like to face his former persecutors in this manner. As I mentioned prior, in 1947, Dieter formally changed his name to Dennis Emberley. In 1948, Dennis was commissioned as an officer in the Canadian Armed Forces and emigrated to Canada. In 1953, Dennis was stationed in the north of Germany with the Canadian Army. And at that time, he met his future wife, a German named Ursula Warmbier, who had been working for the US Embassy in Bonn. In retrospect, I find it a very interesting fact that he would actually return to Germany and marry a German, someone who was not Jewish, who was actually raised Roman Catholic. In 1955, they married, and before moving to Canada. My father's military career would take him all over the globe, including the Gaza Strip from 1959 to 1961 as part of the UN peacekeeping force, the very first military peacekeeping force that was performed by the United Nations. Later on, and this was a posting that I was participated as its pendant to Lahr, Germany, a strategic NATO location which was designed to protect Europe during the Cold War with Russia from 1970 to 1974. I think it's interesting that my father, who had experienced wartime in Germany, would consistently find himself immersed in either wartime or preparation for war conditions, such as the posting to Lahr, Germany. At the time, also, he had a very interesting relationship with Germans in Lahr, because as you can imagine, the base in Lahr was an occupied force, well, a Canadian force posting station where that was designed to protect Western Europe from a potential strike from Russia at the time. And you can imagine that the Germans had mixed feelings about having a foreign military stationed there. Some people felt protected. They were very happy to have the Canadians there. Other people felt uncomfortable. My father, being speaking German fluently, was able to act as a link between the Canadian military and the local German government, the municipal officials, and played a very important role in crossing, creating linkages between the two. And I believe it was part of this reason that he was awarded the Award of Military Merit, which I shall describe shortly. The Order of Military Merit is one of the highest honors bestowed by the Canadian Armed Forces, and it's considered to be at the same level of the Order of Canada. And in 1975, he was awarded this by, at the time, Governor General Jules Leger. Later in 1990, Dennis was awarded the Member of the British Empire, MBE, for exemplary contributions to the British Commonwealth. And this is a picture of my father and my mother in front of Buckingham Palace. My father, Dennis, died in 2006 at the age of 80. He was the only member of his family to survive the Holocaust other than an uncle. This is a picture of him on the right. The person on the left was actually his foster parent. His name was Emil Kasper. Dennis's parents, Bertold and Mina Eger, were deported to Lodz, Poland in October 1941, where they were murdered. His grandmother, Matilda, who also lived with the family, was sent to Theresienstadt concentration camp in Czechoslovakia, where she too was murdered. Um, those of you on the line who've been to Europe may have noticed that in front of certain homes, you'll see copper brass plaques that are called Stolpersteine. These are designed to commemorate the last residents of Holocaust survivors and Holocaust victims. I had the opportunity to go back to Frankfurt in June of this year, where these stones were laid at the very last spot where my father and his family lived. And basically, this is what these stones say, these brass plaques. Here lived Matilda Homburger, born 1868, deported 1942 to Theresienstadt, murdered December 14th, 1943. Here lived Bertold Eger, born 1895, under protective custody, as they called it, which is a bit ironic. Protective custody Buchenwald concentration camp, deported 1941 to Lodz, murdered. Here lived Mina Eger, born Homburger, 1891, deported 1941 to Lodz, murdered. Here lived Dieter Werner Eger, born 1925, Kindertransport 1939, England. So just to wrap up, I often get asked this question, what was it like to have a Holocaust survivor as a parent? In the early years, I would ask my father who my grandparents were. I got great answers from my mother, of course, but when I asked my father, my questions were met with very vague answers and no specifics. My father suffered from PTSD, although at the time it wasn't called that. He never forgot his childhood trauma, relived it constantly, and bore the scars of being left an orphan. He was always admired for professionalism in his military career and his other work. However, it's clear to me that this was like a mask that hid the scars that he had endured. I feel that when I look at a picture of him in uniform, that this was like a coat of armor. When he wore the uniform, it was like nothing could hurt him, but inside he was absolutely tormented. So this concludes my talk, and I really would welcome any questions that you have and any comments. And I really thank you for listening tonight.
Thank you so much, Phil. Thank you for sharing your father's story. We have one question from Stefan. Did your father ever tell the villagers in Lahr that he had been a German?
That is a great question. And I actually I was toying whether or not to mention this. So my father was actually very good friends with the Lord Mayor of Lahr. And they would meet socially. We would have the Lord Mayor over for dinner. We would go over to their place for dinner. And many years after they began this friendship, My father said he struggled whether or not to do this, but he said he actually told this person his story. And had such a chilling effect that their relationship was never the same.
Mm.
And I think the reason for this was that, we tend to think that the Nazis were sort of a small group of, misguided individuals, but there was many people were involved in this. It wasn't just a small group of people. A lot of people had some, they either had maybe family members or they had friends who were very active as Nazis. And so to talk about this, especially with this particular generation, was almost a taboo. If you go to Germany now and you talk to young people, they will talk about it openly, and they will talk about it in the sense that we will never let this happen again. But if you talk to older generations, they will cut off the conversation. They are in denial and they don't want to talk about it. So that's a great question, and it's exactly what happened to my father when he tried to broach this subject.
Mhm. Thank you. And Christine asks, when did you first read his journal?
I first read his journal shortly after his death. So he passed away in 2006. And it's interesting because as a journal reader, I mean, there were lots of things he talked about. He didn't only talk about his youth. He talked about a lot of other things, and it was like, I just want to get to the meat. I want to get to the point where he talks about his childhood. So it takes a lot of patience to get through all
Mhm.
this, because as I say, sometimes it's only very short paragraphs. But yeah, it was around 2006 that I really started to get into it and really dig deeply into the journals. And there's one for every year going back to basically 1982 until he died in 2006.
And Esther asks, did your parents speak German at home? Do you speak German?
That's a great question. Yes, my parents did speak German. Um, when we lived in Germany before we went there, my mother was very determined that I would learn to speak German, and I became fluent. And we actually, as part of the military families, we had the option of either living on the base or living in the community. And my parents said, absolutely not. We're living in the community. We're going to be immersed in German culture. They wanted to expose us to German culture, German literature, German music. And we traveled throughout Germany. And it was very interesting because my father really also was I mean, it was clear that he admired all of this. He admired German literature, he admired German music, German cuisine. But he also mentioned in his journal something that was very interesting. He said, despite of the fact that he had been in Germany repeatedly over the years, he never ever felt comfortable, 100% comfortable. He never felt that. And I find that interesting because in my earlier years, I thought he was actually quite fond of Germans and really felt comfortable, but it was quite different. It wasn't the case at all.
Mhm. Beth asks, how did your father make the transition from the British to the Canadian Army?
Interestingly enough, I think that first of all, I think he met a friend in at some point in who was in the Canadian Army, and my father at the time was actually a non-commissioned soldier in the British Army, and I think his friend mentioned that there was an opportunity if he joined the Canadian Armed Forces that he could become an officer, which was very desirable to my father. And he mentions actually that he actually struggled to write the exams because again he wasn't really a good student. But the his friend told him, he told him about Canada, and he said, there's some great opportunities to join the Canadian Army, and he did. And I think his friend they had a few postings together, and so that gave him that camaraderie. One thing I will mention also, which I don't think I really got this point across, was that my father he felt in his earlier years, especially when he landed in the UK, almost as a rudderless ship. He really had there was no grounding. There was nothing. I mean, his parents were gone. He felt very isolated. The military gave him structure. It gave him, I mean, there was obviously a very clear hierarchy in the military. And I think that's something in retrospect that he needed. He needed this structure in his life. And I think that was probably a saving grace that he was able to first join the British military and then the Canadian afterwards.
Mhm. Mary Lou asks, has the journal or a copy of it been deposited into a Holocaust archive or museum?
No, it hasn't. I would like to look into that. I definitely I want to share it
Mhm.
as part of the record. I've thought about also writing a book because this story has many layers, layers that I haven't even really gotten into. I think it's a story that has a certain amount of appeal. It's a story of resilience. It's a story of someone who really rose from the ashes, and I think it could actually be something that gives people hope who experience the absolute worst and can piece their lives together and create an absolutely wonderful life and a wonderful family.
Mhm. Um, Paul asks, did your father follow Jewish religious and cultural practices in Canada?
No, my father actually converted to the Anglican
Mhm.
Church when he went to the UK. I think that was under the direction of his foster parent. When he met my mother, he then converted again to Roman Catholicism. Interestingly enough, however, though, he was roughly about 2 years before he passed away. He was invited to a synagogue in Vancouver to attend a ceremony. And it was the first time he'd actually, again, stepped into a synagogue. And it was an extremely emotional experience for him. And at that point, my mother had learned most of the story. And it was very touching for her to experience that as well.
Mhm. Um, Catherine asks, when did your father start writing his journals, and do you know how long it took him? How were they organized by time or by location?
So he began approximately 1980. His last journal entry was probably in 2006. He would write a he would write a journal. It was interesting. I would actually gift him a blank journal every year for Christmas, and he would write in it. And so every year he would start a new journal. He would keep them, in his house, and we never read them. I mean, journal is something that's very private. We weren't
Mhm.
really sure if it was something that really would interest us either, because we had no idea what he was actually writing in them.
Mhm. Thank you. And Stefan had a question, I guess, about um, Holocaust denial. Like, how do we combat people in Canada who don't believe the genocide happened? I mean, in many ways, you're combating that right now by telling your father's story. Um,
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really good question. And I think that testimony, I think, is one of the most important ways to do this. We live in a time where there is a tremendous amount of misinformation and disinformation. Having said that, though, it's not really new. And my father actually lived in Vancouver, where actually I lived there as well for many years. And there was a journalist there who was a Holocaust denier. And so this is not something new, but I think it's something that speaks to the need for us to continue telling the stories. My father was never one to publicly speak about this, sadly. He could. And that's why I felt it incumbent upon myself, because I think it's such an interesting story, but it also I will also say that I think every survivor story and every descendant story is slightly different. And I think if you create a patchwork of these stories, it creates something very powerful. And I think part of this is, and this is something I take a lot of pride in, is telling our youth about it, going into schools and telling young people about it, because this is not something that's necessarily been part of their curriculum in the past. Now, fortunately, now it is part of their curriculum, but it's something that's new to them. But when you talk to people, and we obviously in Canada, we have a lot of immigrants who come to the country, and they have experienced their own kind of their own kind of prejudices in their own country, their own authoritarian regimes, their own persecution. Um, when you start to talk about this and you talk about human rights and you talk about democracy, I think they're interested in this. They realize that it's important, and the Holocaust story is one that is in parallel to things that have happened to other people. So I think drawing commonalities is something that's really important, and it helps
Mhm.
to contravene the deniers that are out there.
Thank you. That's really important. If I can ask, because your father was very understandably not able to talk about it much. How did you navigate your connection to the Holocaust despite that when you were growing up?
So I actually only found out about my father's experience when I was 15 years old. So he
Mhm.
had actually been admitted to a hospital where he had actually suffered a psychiatric situation that basically was a result of repressing his memories. And
Mhm.
that's how I learned about it. And it's taken me many years, many years to sort everything out because
Mhm.
you sort of have a story, you have a prefabricated story of your mind about who your parents are and what they're, how they raised you, and you think who your parents are. And it's only later that I found out who my father really was. And it's taken
Mhm.
me so long to get all of this straight in my mind. And it's given me a really avid interest into what happened to Jewish people and how they were persecuted. And it could happen to any marginalized population. It could happen to any um, minority population in any country in the world. And I think there's so many parallels that can be drawn. And that's given me the rationale to talk about it and also to learn more about it. So I I I can speak to it because I never had this education myself, and it's something that I've really only built upon over the years.
Mhm. Thank you so much for helping um, us get that education tonight and through your work. Um, if there aren't any questions, I think that's a good place to wrap up tonight. I would like to thank Phil so much again for his wonderful presentation. It was an honor to get to know um, your father through your presentation and what he went through. Um, and thank you so much to Mina and the CHES for partnering with us for this presentation. It was an honor, and thank you for all the work that you do. And finally, thank you everyone for joining us tonight and for your questions. I hope you have a wonderful rest of night. Thank you.
Thank you.